Okay, I hope you can see the title page now. Um, okay, great. Thanks everyone for joining today's class. If anybody happen to have already listened to the to our previous class, uh, I I I started talking a little bit about the communication rather than language and linguistics, which is what I usually talk about. But I talked a little bit about the communication and the way we communicate and the cues and extra information that we present um, when we communicate that is not verbal, right? That is not language. So last time we talked about how a lot of information can be actually transmitted through the way in which we are speaking something. So such as our intonation, the breaks that we make, um, whether we are choosing the correct words with the correct frequency, etc. And I was talking about how a lot of these things can actually have impact on how the people that we are talking to perceives us. And this is all, which is interesting and hard to control at the same time. This is all subconscious, right? Of course, today I will talk about some things that are subconscious, but also how we can consciously maybe do something about them, right? So today I will be talking about um, the communication, that information that we transmit when we communicate, that is complementing the verbal information, right? Complementing what we say, and I will be mostly focusing on gestures. Uh, so I titled the talk Gestures in Verbal and Nonverbal Communication because that is what I will be talking about mostly. So the outline, let me see why my presentation is not moving. Okay, the outline for today's talk, we will have, let's say, three major parts. First, I will talk about the gestures and how we use them to complement language. So gestures with language, like accompanying language. Um, then I will be talking about gestures as language. So what happens when gestures become a system on their own? And we use them as the basic, as the main means to transmit information. And here I'm talking about sign language. I won't be talking about that too much, but I will. And then we will talk about the gestures on their own. Oh, that would be the nonverbal information, the nonverbal communication, and something that we would call body language, right? And this relates to the gestures that have meaning, that you don't need the language to accompany them to transmit some meaning, right? So let's talk about first about the gestures that accompany language. This is something that we call co-speech gestures. So these are the spontaneous hand movements mostly, but I will correct it here. It's not always hand movements. It also goes with head movements, facial movements, and the general body movements that are usually produced in rhythm with the speech, accompanying speech, and these naturally accompany speech in all spoken languages. And these hand movements is something that has been studied. Here I'm talking about the actual scientific uh, research on this phenomenon, right? So people have shown that us moving hands while we speak is a very, very natural phenomenon that occurs spontaneously, and interestingly, that it's sort of an urge that is really hard to resist. Some people do it more, some people do it less, and there's, of course, a lot of differences across cultures. But research has shown in a very, I couldn't find the video of this experiment, but it's a very interesting study that was done recently, where they asked people, I think it was just people in the street, to explain what happened. For example, they watched a video and then they had to explain it to somebody else, but all the time they had to tie down their hands and not use their hand movements. And it was really, really hard for people not to use their hands. Um, and it has been shown not just that, but people who could not use their hands explain things much worse than people who had their hands to gesture to accompany their speech and to explain things with more, let's say, detail. We will see later that we have different kinds of gestures. So it was shown that this is such a natural phenomenon, and it is such an urge that we have, and that it is not just a decoration, it is not just an additional thing. We actually, it has a function. We use it to better explain things, right? To make a point sometimes. And but what is very interesting is that it was found that even people who are blind, who haven't seen anybody ever signing, never seen a gesture, even though when they um, talk to blind listeners, they gesture, even though they know that the other person won't be able to see the gestures. That is showing that this is some sort of a natural, let's say, instinctive response of the body to accompany speech, right? So gesture serves a variety of functions. Um, and it overlaps with speech in both time and meaning, right? So this is a very interesting thing because when we study communication and when we study language, we think about it as a very one-dimensional thing, right? We think about what is being said or written if we are studying written communication. But lately, it has been shown that gestures actually are an integral part of our communication, and that we should be approaching communication from a more multimodal perspective, right? We should think of communication as consisting of several things, one of them being the verbal information, language, and the other part being the gestures, because it has been shown that it is a very important part of our communication. So the let's say the climate is changing a little bit with more and more people, even research groups in very important language centers opening up to study this phenomenon of co-speech gestures and how they actually provide, how they actually make communication better. And very interesting to think about are the situations where you can think that gestures can actually help, right? They can improve the situations. Um, because when we study communication or language, we think about an ideal situation, but this is not what happens in the wild. In the wild, when we talk, when we communicate, there can be a lot of noise, right? So if we're talking about spoken language, um, there can be a lot of noise, and gestures can help us transmit the information in a more effective way. Or it has been shown that in studies where people are listening to the speech in their second language, where you're not very proficient, gesturing helps you a lot because it helps understand the meaning of the words that you're not completely sure about. And think about yourselves, right? When you go somewhere where you don't speak the language, the combination of gesturing um, and the spoken, if you know a little bit of language, it really helps the situation. It really helps the understanding when you have the gestures. This is why, for example, I also like to when I speak in the language that I'm not a native speaker of, I hate phone conversations because I cannot see a person. So I prefer to communicate in person or on a video call in the language that I'm not very proficient in, right? Because I will have a lot of body movements and a lot of complementary information from the visual system coming to make me to help me understand. And what is very interesting is that even in typical listening situations, um, gestures often have unique information that is not present in the speech signal. This is what I mentioned before. So it is not just that I'm repeating what I already said verbally. It is not just that I'm repeating, but often I am adding something specific, right? So, for example, you can think of an example where somebody was explaining how a football player kicked the ball, right? Now you see that with my hand movement, which is accompanying my speech, and I made a movement as I was pronouncing kicking the ball, but with my movement, I explained the trajectory, how the ball went, right? So the information of how the ball was kicked was not present in the verbal information, it was present in the gesture, right? So you can see how they always add something. And this is why in the experiment with where people couldn't use their hands, we saw that those people who were able to use their hands to explain the video that they saw provided a much better description. They were better understood, and it was a more, let's say, a more detailed explanation of the event because they had hand movements to accompany them and to add detail and some additional information about the event. So we saw this has to do with the also in line with what I said earlier about the blind people. Um, they people are producing gestures even when they know that the listeners cannot see them. So, for example, if you think of a phone conversation, people usually gesture on the phone, even a little bit. Some people more, some people less. Uh, but even though they know and they are perfectly aware of the fact that the listener cannot see them, but it is something that comes automatically, right? Although definitely studies have shown that speakers indeed gesture more when they can be seen, right? So we are both doing it subconsciously because we are we cannot stop it in a way, but also we know that this will help the understanding. So if we know that somebody can see us, we gesture even more, right? Okay. So there are several types of co-speech gestures. Um, the two most common types, the two biggest groups would be representative and non-representative. So representative would be those that are symbolic and they have some meaning in them. For example, the gesture that I saw about the kicking the ball, that has some meaning in it because it is carrying the meaning of how the trajectory of the ball looked like, right? These are, for example, with the so-called iconic gestures. They usually depict the size, the shape, or the action or position of the object that we are talking about, right? Or we can say, oh, he brought a cake to work, right? And here I'm showing, that it was a round, big cake. Although I didn't say anything about the shape or size, but my gesture is saying that. So these iconic gestures. Then metaphoric gestures, which when we talk about something that is abstract, right? Um, Doing an action makes it plays on the metaphor and makes it concrete. And we can also have deictic gestures, which are used to refer to the location in space, right? So I can say, for example, you can ask me where the cat is, and I can say it's there, right? And I'm showing to the location. So these have some meaning in them. But we can also have non-representative gestures. They're called beat gestures, which is interesting because that has to do with the fact that they're following the beat or the rhythm of the speech. And these are usually have no particular meaning, but are used uh, to stress, to accentuate, emphasize certain words, right? Like this that I'm doing now, right? To stress. Um, they are usually brief, simple movements, usually with the hands and, noddings with the head. Uh, and they don't have any meaning on their own. But this is something, for example, if you go to any class of public speaking, um, politicians usually undergo that kind of training. They're being usually told that they should use these bead gestures to prove a point, right? When they're talking, to be more persuasive when they talk, right? So these are called non-bead gestures. And then we can distinguish all of these from some gestures that are not co-speech gestures. They are gestures, but not co-speech gestures. These are the so-called emblems. This is when you have a sign that has a meaning on its own, and you don't need a speech for it, right? So, for example, in a game, in a match, when an umpire crossing or and extending arms to indicate that the runner is safe or timeout, right? Certain signs that have their meaning because it's conventionalized and everybody knows what it means, right? Or that this means okay, right? This does not need speech for the meaning, and this is called an emblem. And we will see in the next slide that there are many more. And the other thing is a pantomime. That is not a co-speech gesture. That it's a gesture on its own because you can explain everything. It is replacing the speech, right? Now, so that is different from the co-speech gestures because co-speech gestures can only be understood together with the speech. On their own, they don't mean anything. But there are some of these emblems and some gestures that are very interesting and that in some languages are very prominent. And Italian is one of the languages where I guess many of you know they have very strong gestures that both accompany speech, but also those that no, they don't. And it's a whole, they call it a separate language, right, of gestures. Um, this is a very interesting point because we know that gestures vary across cultures. And it's interesting to know that the same thing can mean different things in different cultures too. So we have to be aware also of these uh, uh, cross-linguistic differences. But studies have found that gesturing is something that is present in all known cultures and linguistic backgrounds, right? But for example, in Italian, the co-speech gestures and these emblems are particularly strong, such as in this famous book by Bruno Munari, um, the fine art of the gesture, and it's called Speak Italian, right? It's a little bit of a joke because it's not about speaking; it's about gesturing. But these are some of the very common gestures emblems, so not co-speech gestures but emblems in Italian. For example, the last one and the one in the cover in the book, right? It's a question, right? It means what do you mean, what do you want? It's a question, right? So it has to be understood from the context. But if you have your friend at the end of the room, um and you're looking for a table where to sit and he just goes like this, it means which one? Right? So you have to use the context to interpret these, but usually they have very uh the meaning that is very recognizable in the culture, and in Italian it is particularly strong. Okay, so these were the gestures that follow speech. I will now move a little bit on to the gestures that have become a language on their own, right? And this is the sign language. First of all, we should know that there is this myth that sign language is just gesturing. And this is not true. There is a reason why we call it sign language, not sign gesturing system, right? It is just language, like we have spoken languages, like we have written language modality. It's a language in a different modality. It's just a visual, right? They use their language that uses hands or body to encode the information rather than the voice, right? So it's just a visual language. But these sign languages have their own vocabulary, their own construction, their own so called phonetics, although it's not the same thing as in spoken languages, and their own grammar system and syntax, right? They have their own rules. And sometimes, if you would think that a sign language is just showing, doing the pantomime, it is not. There is some iconicity between the signs and the content, the meaning of it, but it is not always the case, right? For example, in many sign languages, the gesture for thank you is like this, touching the chin, right? So there is nothing about the chin and thank you, right? You're not just trying to show anything about what you're saying. It is not just a pantomime. There is an arbitrary connection, like we have in the languages, arbitrary connection between the sign and what it means. And you have to know the language to know the connection, right? The same way that we know that um, um, chair, the word chair refers to that object that we are sitting on. That's how we need to learn it in sign language too, right? It cannot be inferred from just looking at the signer. And there was the famous case in the United States that there was a fake signer. I think it was a police detective that was giving a press conference, and they called a signer to sign the notification, the message that the sheriff was saying, and the signer was not a sign language interpreter. It was just a woman who was trying to pretending that she was signing. But because people didn't know sign language, I mean, she was, it was a fraud, right? But then later, people who actually know the American Sign Language called and said this person wasn't signing; she was just showing random things to appear as she was signing. So, uh, 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 yes. Uh, what is the important thing I wanted to say here? What that means, if the sign languages are the same as languages, does that mean that there are many sign languages? Yes, absolutely, yes. Because they are not completely iconic, because they're developed as a system, same as oral languages, you have many sign languages in the world. Right now, it is believed that there are 300 sign languages around the world, right? And it is not always the case that the languages, the sign languages, um, correspond to the spoken language, right? For example, in the United States, the spoken language is English and the sign language is the American Sign Language, right? But in Britain, spoken language is English, but the sign language is English Sign Language, right? So a signer from Britain, a signer, so a person who is using sign language, and a signer from the United States cannot really understand each other. So it does not always follow the distribution of the spoken language. And I would like to play a video here. Let me see if I manage to share. Let me see if this works. Okay. I hope you can see this. I'm not sure about the audio, but you actually don't need the audio. There are titles and people will be signing. So, oops, sorry. Oops, sorry. I'm sorry. Let me just find the video. I don't know why this. Okay. Here it goes. Okay. Different people introducing themselves in different sign languages. This is New Zealand Sign Language. Okay, so that was the video in sign language. So as you could see, not every sign language is the same. They are in this video. It was uh, it was practical because you could see the same sentence being signed in different sign languages. And what is also different about sign languages is because they're using bodies and because they're using physical space. Um, there are several important concepts. They're using, as you saw, their facial expressions, and the facial expressions have grammatical functions, right? So depending on the sign language, you could have, for example, the same way as we would use intonation to ask a question or a certain word order. In sign language, the meaning that something is a question would be indicated by eyebrow movement, right? So you use the facial expressions to add meaning to what you're signing. They're also using space to sign. So, for example, when they would want to say that something is here or there, they would use the space around them also to indicate the first or third or the second person. They would show it on their own body, the other person being there and then indicating to that person here, right? So it is a language that expresses different meanings and grammatical functions using the visual information and the space, basically using the body and the space around the body. So as you can see, sign languages are definitely full languages, not just a bunch of gestures that are pantomime, that is something that is easy or transparent to understand. You actually need to know the sign system in order to understand what they're signing. And there are many, many different sign languages, and it's becoming also a very interesting topic in research. Okay. So this is what happens when the gesture, sorry, I'm trying to change the slide. This is what happens when the gesture becomes the language on its own, right? Um, First we saw the gesture in combination with speech, then we saw the gesture becoming a language on its own. Now we're going away from the language again, and here it is. Um, Going back to gestures a lot alone again, and talking about them without language. So going beyond the language, and not just gestures, but all kinds of body movement, something that we would call body language, and the information that we actually transmit with our body behavior when we communicate, and that has nothing to do with language. And this is called the nonverbal communication, right? So, what is the nonverbal communication? It's a transfer of information, because when you think about it, communication is that it is transfer of information. Language is one way to do it. Nonverbal communication is other way to do it. So it is a transfer of information from one person to another without the use of words or spoken or written language. And here we have gestures as only one way to use to transmit information non-verbally. Other thing is facial expression. Other thing is eye contact. Other thing is body posture, body position. This is particularly important for the distance between people. This is also all communicating something, right? And when we say communicating or transferring information, it does we don't mean necessarily very concrete messages, but also it transfers our attitude, our beliefs, how we feel about something. This is all the information that is being transmitted through nonverbal communication, right? Now, what I think is very, very interesting to talk about when we talk about this body language is how this is actually same as languages, same as we have, different languages in different countries or different cultures. That way, we also have differences in body language and in these particular aspects. There are a lot of overlapping things across the cultures, but given that nonverbal communication is so, let's say, subconscious, I think it's very important to be particularly and additionally aware of these cross-cultural differences when it comes to nonverbal communication. Um, so, for example, one aspect of nonverbal communication is eye contact, right? So, for example, in Western Europe, North America, and Australia, these cultures generally overlap when it comes to eye contact in the way that eye contact is appropriate. That is a general thing. And we're talking about the business context too, right? So, eye contact is considered a basic element of social interactions, right? And not just that it's okay to maintain eye contact, but it's also a desirable, because if you don't do it, it is considered maybe that you are showing that you're not interested, right? So not giving eye contact may be shown, may be seen as a lack of respect. For example, in my culture too, um, it's a lack of respect, or interpreted as a person is lying and not being honest or bluffing. So, for example, in Russia, intense eye contact is shown to used to show sincerity, right? However, in Asian cultures, there is more importance on the respect of each other, and especially if the respect is needs to come from different hierarchies, right? So different positions in the hierarchy, right? So you would have in countries such as China or South Korea or Japan, it is not, eye contact is not so essential for social interaction, and can sometimes, depending on the relation between the two people speaking, can be even inappropriate, right? Because of this hierarchy, and because it is seen that if somebody is hierarchically subordinate, they should not make very steady eye contact with their superiors, right? And then in varying African or Latin American cultures, of course, there are a lot of differences, but sometimes intense eye contact can even be seen as aggressive, right? Or confrontational, or maybe disrespectful. So see how different it is. It's in one culture, it can be, like having intense eye contact can be seen as respectful and trying to be honest, whereas in the other cultures, it's like too aggressive to the point of being disrespectful. And in Middle Eastern cultures, um, eye contact is maybe less so common and less appropriate. Maybe between the same genders, it can be a sign of trust and sincerity, yes. But between the opposite genders, especially in the Muslim cultures, it is not appropriate to maintain long eye contact, right? Only brief eye contact is considered appropriate. Then when it comes to, for example, shaking the head no and nodding yes, you would think that a general thing is in most parts of Western Europe, Africa, Middle East, North America, China too. Shaking your head like this from side to side means no, and nodding up and down means yes. And you would think that that is universal, but no, actually, in some cultures, in Greece, it is not so. Bulgaria and Albania also, a head shake, but it has to be a certain head shake. I'm not from there, so I don't want to do it wrongly. So shaking your head from to the left and then to the right, I think it's only two times. It means yes, actually. Whereas to say no, you would have to tilt the head back a little bit like this. Um, so it's actually the shaking, it means yes. And so in Saudi Arabia, they shake their head to say yes, and tip their head back to say no, also in Iran. And in Japan and most of Asia, uh, nodding up and down is the way to show that somebody is listening, and to show that it's interested in what you're saying. It does not always mean yes, but more like generally, yes, I am being respectful, I'm listening, I am interested in what you're saying. Whereas in India, to indicate that you're listening, people might be shaking side to side, having side to side movements, right? So you can even see that these basic head movements have differences across cultures. And then there is another nonverbal behavior, and that is touch, right? This is very important because we saw that, for example, in certain countries such as the United States, North America, Western Europe, they encourage a lot of eye contact. But for example, the communicating through touch and making any physical touch is not appropriate. But here, for example, physical touch is in general, encouraged in Iran, India, France, Greece, Turkey, Italy, Russia, Spain, most of Latin America. It is completely normal, for example, to touch somebody's hand if you're talking to them. Many Saudi Arabians express their respect for others by, maybe holding hands, shaking hands. But this would usually be between men and not between men and women, right? But then in the other countries, such as the United Kingdom, the United States, Germany, Australia, Japan, Canada, New Zealand, and Northern Europe, it is not really, especially in the business settings, it is not very encouraged to touch people, right? So this is something that if you go back to our first slides when I talked about how intuitive and how we have urge to make gestures, if it's very natural for us, if we come from a culture like I do where it's normal to, touch somebody's arm or touch somebody's hand while we're talking, we have to be very aware, especially if we are in a formal context and if we are in business or academic context, that when we are in these cultures such as, the United Kingdom, the US, it's not really appropriate to go on and touch people. So you have to be a little bit aware of that. But at the same time, people from those different cultures are aware that in our cultures, this is normal. So it should be mutual, right? The origins of studying nonverbal behavior um, are usually traced back. I mean, I said that the gestures in combination with language is not something that has been studied a lot, but the gesturing on their own, the nonverbal behavior, has been studied for a long time and is traced back to Darwin's seminal work um, uh, from the 1872 on the expressions of the emotions in man and animal, right? And but in this case, it was discussed mostly from the point of view of how nonverbal behavior transmits information about our emotions, which is of course a very big topic. Other work comes from the other fields that have nothing to do with communication and linguistics, such as not nothing to do. Other fields that are not strictly speaking linguistics or communication studies, but are neighboring fields, such as anthropology, where they study something that is called kinesics, which is the study of body movements, right? Or proxemics, which is the study of personal space. And Hall made this theory in 1963, the theory of what is considered a personal space, what is considered an appropriate space or distance to make between your different people, depending on their relation, etc. And this obviously depends on the cultures too. Now, this is when it comes to the scientific study. Now, I would like to, in the last part of this talk, to talk about something that is a little bit less scientific, and this is why I am giving like an announcement that what I'm going to say, you won't see any references to any scientific papers in the next several slides, because it is more based on something that is not so scientifically proven, but it is being used in practice based on some observations and on some actual scientific studies, but this has now become a sort of pseudo-scientific research on body language. And the most important field within which body language is investigated half scientifically is court, right? Because a lot of attention has been given to how people in the court behave, given that what is being spoken, so the verbal information that is being given in court, is very controlled. And when people talk in court, they know that every word can be taken against them, etc. But given that body language is not something that we control so much, it has become a very important topic to, gain some extra information about that. So, for example, if you have a witness or an attorney in a courtroom, information such as his posture, his facial expressions, his gestures, even eye movements, they can subtly impact how the words are being received, both by the jury, if you have a jury in the system, and by the judge, right? And the most important thing is probably witness credibility, meaning whether you trust this witness, whether somebody is telling the truth, right? Nonverbal behavior is being used to determine this a lot, whether it accompanies the verbal content, right? So witnesses who fail to manage their body language or demeanor, where you see some mismatch between what is being said and what is behavior showing, these witnesses are often perceived as, not being truthful, evasive, non-responsive, or defensive, right? So this is why lawyers, because they are aware of this, prepare their witnesses to be aware of these body behaviors, to appear as they are very professional and to have positive body language. For example, the Supreme Court of Canada states that a trial judge can take into account the significant, for example, pauses in the responses, and that has to do with what I talked about last time about these paralinguistic cues, the pauses, the intonation, etc. Can take into account the significant pauses in the responses, the changes in facial expression, or the looks of anger, confusion, and concern, right? So they can take it, right? A very famous method, again, I'm saying it's not strictly speaking scientific, half scientific, um, is used in the United States by the investigators. It's called the behavior analysis interview that they use within the READ technique. And this behavior analysis interview, I don't know if you are watching some documentary shows on crime, for example, from the States, they often analyze people's behavior using this READ technique, right? So what they do is usually they do an interview with the suspect or with the witnesses, and they're using this behavior analysis interview. They try to, based on the body language, determine whether the person is telling the truth about the crime or not. Now, you understand how dangerous this is, because as we said, this is not exact science. We don't have these things scientifically proven in an experimental setting that whenever a person moves their head like this, it means they are lying, right? This is all very descriptive. And given what we know about the differences in body language across the cultures, you can imagine how many body behaviors can mean different things in different contexts and different cultures. So you can see how dangerous it is to just take the body language and conclude whether somebody is telling the truth or not about the crime. I mean, it's a big deal, right? Somebody's life might depend on it. So these investigators that are working on in crime cases, and they are using this READ technique, are being trained a lot to know how to exactly interpret it, to use it as an investigative tool with caution, having a lot of ethical considerations, right? uh, these nonverbal cues are not infallible evidence of a deceit or guilt. Just because somebody looks nervous because they're moving their hands too much doesn't mean they're guilty. Maybe they are just in a anxiety driving situation, and that's it, right? So relying too heavily on them without having the actual evidence can lead to disasters, right? And to conclusions, and people, being mistakenly, wrongfully accused. But okay, so as I said, this is, a pseudoscientific approach. But what the investigators use in this READ technique and in these situations is certain things that are, they pay attention to certain things that are common indicators or of deception, right? This is what they're usually looking for. Is the person trying to deceive us? So, for example, if the facial expressions are inconsistent, for example, because genuine emotions are typically reflected spontaneously across the entire face, right? So if you have delayed emotion in comparison to what you're saying, or if only you're smiling but your eyes are not moving, etc., this is usually not. This is a sign that something might be off. The avoidance of eye contact, but again, as we said, it really depends on the culture, right? So you have to think about the culture that the person is coming from. because avoiding eye contact can indicate either nervousness or discomfort, but it can also be a sign of deceit. When coupled with other behaviors, so you have to be careful how to interpret it. Um, for example, using physical barriers. This is also a subconscious way of um, of an attempt to create some kind of space or psychological barrier, like I don't want to tell you anything. Changes in posture a lot, crossing arms or legs suddenly might suggest some sort of defensiveness or some sort of subconscious attempt to protect oneself from disinterrogation, right? And also some micro expressions, such as very rapid or involuntary facial expressions, that can actually reveal true emotions. This is what investigators are often chasing. When you see that a person is trying to show one emotion, but actually in this micro expressions, you see their true emotions coming to the surface, right? So skilled investigators are sometimes able to spot fleeting, short, and rapid signs of sadness, anger, fear, or disgust. But as I said, it is very important to interpret all this with caution. The investigators usually have a baseline and determine the baseline behavior of a person, and then see how that behavior changes or whether it remains the same when people are asked these difficult questions, right? But it's important to keep in mind that every person displays stress or deception differently. You basically are looking at the deflections from the baseline. And also, it's never, as I said, it's never one thing only. It's usually clusters of behaviors, um, and always accompanying speech, right, in these situations, right? And then based on this, again, pseudoscience, knowing all that, the lawyers usually, hopefully none of you will need this, but lawyers usually advise um, their witnesses, or defendants, depending who they're representing, when they go to the court, to be aware of all these things, to don't to maintain eye contact, not fidgeting too much, to not look nervous, to make their face not look very tense, to not make too many hand movements, but they want to make some, because you don't want to look too closed off too. You don't want to have a posture that is, crossing your hands, your arms and legs, so that you look like you're defensive, etc., etc., right? Because they know that how they look like, people will conclude something from it. And as the last slide, just to have a little bit of time for questions lately, all this obviously can be applied to business situations too, right? Um, we know that even though maybe the person who is hiring us in a, let's say, a business interview situation, although these things are subconscious, but we know, as we said, non-body and gestures and non-verbal information is transfer of information, right? So when we whatever we are doing is saying something to the other person subconsciously, right? So we want to, these are some of the things that are, you can also go to a trainer, somebody who's training these kinds of things, but everything is based on the same, let's say, body of observations about body language. And this is that we should appear open, right? And that we should communicate calmness and professionalism. So, even how we dress should be, tell something to the other person that we are being professionals. Our posture, we should not look closed off, but, open our arms, etc. Not put our head down and look to the floor, but, look up. Maintain eye contact if appropriate in your culture, right? You will know whether it is or not, but maintaining eye contact and smiling, again, if appropriate in your culture. Smile is another thing that is really also depends on the culture, because in some cultures, if you smile too much, you appear, you might be interpreted as not professional and a little bit silly, right? But for example, in the Western cultures, a modest smile means that you're being polite. Actually, it is also meant. It is also believed that leaning forward shows interest, and that also you should gesture, but not too many gestures, so that you don't appear chaotic. And okay, I could be talking about this for hours, but let me stop there and let me take, I think we have 5 minutes for some questions. Thank you.
You, Yes.